Good afternoon. My name is Spenser Darden. I am the Director for Diversity Initiatives and Community Engagement, and I use he and they pronouns. I would like to welcome you to today's panel discussion entitled Identifying and Combating Structural Racism, which is presented by the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at West Virginia University. This is the first in a series of panel discussions designed to reflect on the ways that 2020 has been a year that has recentered oppression and injustice, and to understand how we can all work towards understanding how to be compelled towards making a positive difference, and to see this as a moment for opportunity. Today, we are using the Zoom webinar platform, which includes the Q&A function. In this function, you can write any questions that you may have, and if you see a question that you agree with, there's no need to ask the question again. Simply give it an upvote, and the panelists will know it's a popular question. Today, we have a lot of fantastic panelists, and I'd like to start by introducing them for this afternoon's discussion. Our first panelist is Dr. Linda Alexander, Senior Associate Dean for Academic, Student, and Faculty Affairs. Dr. Alexander is a professor in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences and currently serves as the Senior Associate Dean for Academic, Student, and Faculty Affairs for the West Virginia University School of Public Health. Her formal public education includes degrees from James Madison University and the University of Virginia. She served as a postdoctoral fellow in cardiovascular disease epidemiology at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Alexander's research primarily focuses on the complex understanding of the burden of tobacco-related diseases among underrepresented and U.S. socially disadvantaged populations. Welcome, Dr. Alexander. Our second panelist is Dr. Constinia Charbonnette. Dr. Charbonnette earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Howard University, a Master of Science degree in secondary mathematics from the University of New Haven, and a Master of Business Administration, as well as a Doctor of Education degree from West Virginia University. Welcome, Dr. Charbonnette. Our third panelist, Dr. Cris Mayo, is the director of the LGBTQ Center and professor in Women's and Gender Studies. In 2019, Dr. Mayo was named a recipient of the Regional 2019 LGBTQ Leadership Award from the National Diversity Council in Pennsylvania, which goes to those who work on creating a culture of inclusiveness in the workplace, advocating for protections for LGBTQ+ individuals, and influencing positive change community-wide. Prior to being at WVU, Dr. Mayo was the director of online learning, College of Education at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. In 3 single-authored books, Mayo has focused on advocating for LGBTQ+ youth. Welcome, Dr. Mayo. And our final panelist is Dr. Jim Nolan, professor and chair in sociology. Dr. Nolan teaches courses in the area of crime and social control, and his research currently focuses on neighborhood dynamics, police procedures, crime measurement, hate crimes, and equity and inclusion in higher education. Dr. Nolan previously worked as a police officer in Wilmington, Delaware for 13 years and worked for the FBI as a unit chief in the Crime Analysis, Research, and Development Unit that provided management oversight for the National Hate Crime Data Collection Program. Welcome, Dr. Nolan. Today's discussion is going to be one in which we unpack this idea of structural racism to identify what it is and in the different areas of our everyday life that it shows up. For our first question, it's going to go to all of our panelists, and we are wondering, this is a conversation about structural racism. What does that mean, and how is it similar to or different from individual racism?
Okay, I think I'll start. And I think this is a good question, and I'm sure that I could get a myriad of dictionaries and formal definitions, but I think that as it relates to this panel and my participation today, I think to me it speaks more to structural racism speaks more to systems that are contrived to perpetuate a certain condition for people based on their race. So it's a systematic force, it's an infrastructure, it's formal structures designed to perpetuate a notion that all don't belong. And I'll just stop there.
If I could jump in, for me, I'd like to echo what my colleague has just indicated about this being a larger structure, and say that this means that those of us who are in higher education, sorry, I'm getting multiple start my video requests here and turning them all on, means that those of us in higher education need to understand more than just universities. We need to understand how public schools are feeding into universities. We need to understand how the communities in which our universities are situated are creating racist experiences and have histories that affect the students that come here. And so it's that broader look, that more ecological look of where higher education is situated across time, not only the time of the student, but the time of the place as well.
I really appreciate that answer, both that Dr. Alexander and Dr. Mayo provided, as a way for us to sort of contextualize this idea of racism as being a broader feature of our society. And part of what we are going to be talking about today is everything from policing to the business community to how racism is a manifestation and another form of things like transphobia and homophobia. And so I'm really interested to sort of get into some of those questions, because I want to unpack this idea of the structural racism as opposed to just this idea of individual racism, which is what we're really sort of conditioned to think about as racism as just a few bad people or mean people doing bad things. So our first question is going to be directed to Dr. Nolan, you directly. Can you speak to a couple examples of how structural racism is embedded into the institution of policing? And can you help us understand if this idea of hiring more liberal officers or more officers of color will help combat this idea of structural racism?
Sure, I'd be glad to take that question. My answer might be a little long, and I'm sorry. I even have a diagram that we may pull up here in a minute. But as we have seen recently with the number of police shootings, we typically think about the racism in policing as being structured. In other words, it's not random, it's routine. And so we sort of wonder how that happens. About 1,000 people are shot and killed by the police each year. A disproportionate number are non-white people, and it's even more bizarre than that. And since 12-year-old Tamir Rice was shot and killed in a Cleveland park, 162 other people with toy guns have been killed by the police. A good number of those are people of color. And so even when we watch George Floyd, the agony of George Floyd, we wonder, are these people going to be arrested? Is this going to solve the problem? And so, I believe, and my research says that, no, this is because it's structured, because of the way things are, that it's not the bad apple officer that's the problem. And so in some of my classes, I use this image of, I call it the allegory of the dangerous. And I'll go through it quickly, but it gives you an idea of what I mean by structure, because there's actually different levels of structure. One structure is social class. There's wealthy and there's poor, and poverty begets poverty, wealth begets wealth, and these are structured. And then we meet each other in structured ways. We come into contact with each other. That's also a form of structure. And then there's the type of structure that is really, some people consider culture, because it's when we adhere to a social structure and we internalize that social structure, that's also a form of structure. So there's 3 levels of structure. So I use this image of the allegory. I better check before I go on. Is this okay to talk about this now, Spencer? Or
Yes, absolutely. This is fantastic.
Okay. So anyway, the idea is this: that the game, or what the police do, they're called law enforcement officers. So they're socialized into a profession that makes them think that we're going to make places safe by enforcing the law. All organizational rewards and recognition are set up to reward people for locking people up. They get into police cars, they go into communities, and they're looking for bad people to arrest. And they get status and prestige in the organization by doing this. So here's, in this example here in front of you, I have two cars in the middle of an intersection. And this is actually is something like what the police draw when they go to an accident scene. So if you look at the inner circle, you see that vehicle A and B have collided. And so if you're a good officer, you realize they both have a green light. And so you have to pick one or determine which one is at fault. In this case, it's B, because they turn in front of A, vehicle A. And so if you're a good officer, you might check the database and find out that this intersection, there's lots of accidents here. And since you're a law enforcement officer, you're going to sit up every time you have a chance, and you're going to cite people for making an illegal turn. And so an officer may do that for a while and realize that it's a pretty lucrative thing to do this, because you get some tickets, but you also find people who are wanted for failure to pay fines. You find people, you smell a little marijuana, or you may get a gun out of a car or something like this. So it's not just traffic tickets that you're arresting, but you're a law enforcement officer, you're making lots of arrests. Now, if you do this, this goes on for long periods of time, decades, whole careers where this happens. And people train, some cops train other cops that this is a lucrative place to find arrests. And then someone tells you one day, you know, if we stagger these lights, we could fix this so that there's no accidents here. And the officers are going to say, well, I can see that would be a good thing in one sense, but the other sense is that, you know, it's pretty good for us to make lockups. It's like a good fishing hole. It's a place where you can get, you can find people to arrest. Anyway, sometimes I ask my students, now imagine these officers go to school and become sociologists, and then you want to get a bigger picture and find out what's actually really happening. And they go up to about 30,000 feet and look down on this intersection, and they see what's really happening. That wealthy vehicle A are all coming out of wealthy neighborhood and usually going straight to the finance industry. Vehicle B, it's structured. They're coming out and going left to the service and fast food industry. So this is the structured nature of the intersection. So there's a structure. The game that the police are playing is structured. The structured way that they meet is a form of structure. And because this happens, wealthy neighborhood learns to see poor neighborhood, vehicle A and B, as they're always wrong. They're always hitting their car and they're taking off. They're always getting tickets. These are the ones that keep getting arrested. And so my police officer who's taking sociology courses decides that he's going to do a survey in poor neighborhood and wealthy neighborhood. And he finds out that they both admit to committing traffic violations at the same rate. But if you go into the court, you find out that poor neighborhood is actually overrepresented. And if you go to the police and you say that you're racist in the way you're giving out tickets, they're going to say, I'm not racist. I give it to B because they're violating the law. And so you know, this goes on for a long period of time. And what happens then is that there's so many people from poor neighborhood who get tickets from this type of enforcement that they can't call the police when they need them, and a code of the street develops. They have to settle their own disputes. So violence emerges in these neighborhoods disproportionately. So it's the bigotry that is wrapped all into this in all kinds of levels of structure. So there's the structure of social class, there's the structure of the way they intersect, there's the structure of the way they think about things. These all are forms of structure that contribute to the problem. And then I'll stop talking now, but I have some thoughts about how to move forward from this.
This is great, and I really appreciate that graphic, because one of the things you did, Dr. Nolan, is you talked about the disparity in the social class as a wealthy neighborhood and a poor neighborhood. But we also highlighted the fact that there's a disparity as to who occupies those stratified neighborhoods, that it's disproportionately people of color in those poor neighborhoods as compared to the wealthy neighborhoods. So one of the things that we'll get back to is kind of asking the question of how did that happen, and how does that represent a structured form of racism in and of itself. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. So for our next presenter, I'd like to ask Dr. Charbonnette to talk a little bit about this idea of capitalism and our corporate structures that perpetuate racism, and to talk a little bit about what that looks like and what we can learn about structured racism in the corporate world. And I believe you're muted.
You would think I'd be used to Zoom by now, right? Can you hear me now? Good. All right. So first, I want to thank the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the invitation to serve on this very important and timely panel. And I also want to highlight 2 points about the spirit of my involvement in this panel. One, it's important to note I don't speak for all Black folks. My response to any questions or comments represent my research and lived experiences, so that is important for me to say. The second, that is equally important, is that I don't speak for, nor am I affiliated with the WVU College of Business any longer. So I want to make sure that I'm framing this appropriately. So to answer your question of how does capitalism and our corporate structures perpetuate and reinforce racism, well, that is a very, very big question, right? So I'm going to kind of chunk that along. I'm going to borrow from Dr. Ibram Kendi's 2018 book of How to Be an Anti-Racist. And if folks have not picked that up, please do, or stamped his previous book that won the 2016 National Book Award. But he classifies racism and capitalism as conjoined twins, which is very interesting to me. Kind of like the same body, different personalities, different faces. He talks about essentially, and this is also I'm borrowing from Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery from 1944, that's getting some recent push, is that the origins of racism cannot be separated, period. Of course, the wealth that was built, right, during slavery, during the slavery times, it was essential to our world dominance. Well, let's look at that in essence of how is it that our structures are so grounded and rooted in free labor? Our structures are grounded and rooted in power and dehumanization, and largely the wealth and success was really attributed to the slaveholders. So our economic policies, our practices, our harmful racial policies, this all links back to the institution of slavery and also has lifted us in terms of the capitalism that we know now.
Thank you so much. And yeah, the books by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi have been getting a lot of discussion, and I think rightfully so, as he acknowledges both the history of racism and how it is that we came to form our idea of what racism is. And so he really examines this difference between racist ideas and racist policy and which informed the other. And so I find it really fascinating that you were sort of talking about that as the two cannot be disentangled. And so this idea of protesters then turning to quote unquote looters and defacing of property and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is there symbolism in these actions, or what does that sort of experience and that type of action mean to communities of color, and in this instance, the Black community, as a response to the murder of George Floyd?
Okay, and thank you for saying his name of what prompted this. And also, again, I'm going to reiterate, I don't speak for all Black folks, but I will share some of my personal past and history. So I want to first say that I'm unsure about what you mean by the symbolism. However, what I can offer is my thoughts about the significance of the folks who ask those questions, their inability to recognize the pain, the distress, the deep-rooted dehumanization that Black folks face every day, not only in the streets, not only when folks are being pulled over or by what they may call bad apples, but we'll talk about that later. Hopefully, I know Dr. Nolan is going to address that. And then we also see the unfortunate instances of destruction, looting, and the like. My question often is, what conversations were we having before that? And I'm not condoning violence in any way. What I can do is offer, again, this personal experience is that many folk know that I am from South Central Los Angeles. I was in the epicenter of the 1992 riots in South Central Los Angeles. I recognize in my community, and this is kind of resurfacing now as I talk to folks back home about the feelings and what the pain was, and how and the lack of quality schools, the lack of job opportunities, the lack of respect by business owners within that community. And what was that, and why did we lash out, or why did they lash out, so to speak? And again, and then I link back now as an educator, I think back to the Freirean principles of pedagogy of the oppressed, in terms of how does the violence erupt when we are silenced? How is it that we meet violence with violence when we are smothered? And also how how the oppressed group and the oppressors must come together. Again, that is a very, very complicated and dynamic question. But what I can ask is, how is it that folks were supposed to protest? How is it that we're having this national conversation now? And hopefully we'll move forward outside of pediatric dialogue.
Yeah, and I can't help but think about the fact that, you know, and the same time that folks are quoting Dr. King and talking about nonviolence as being the answer and the solution, Dr. King also did sort of examine this capitalist society and ask how a society built upon injustice can be more cared about, right? How we care about our physical structures in that form of society, than ensuring that all folks are able to experience a just society. So yeah, I think we should definitely and will definitely talk a little bit more about what does it mean to have this sort of embedded racism in the ways that capitalism and corporate structures have been built, because I think it's really root in understanding the ways that this is endemic to our society rather than a reflection of bad individual actors.
I also want to add, this is again coming on the backdrop of COVID,
Yes.
right? So we're seeing this kind of we had this smoldering fire where, you know, these are not new conversations for communities of color, particularly for Black folks. I mean, if you want to go back and listen to the first NWA album, or, you know, when we talk about the Sugar Hill Gang and we're talking about real hip hop through the lens of critical and revolutionary theory, it became a story, the news reporter of these Black and brown communities in big cities across the country. The same conversations that we were having back in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, and of course, this is my generation again, and the research that I've done. It's the same story. It hasn't changed, right? And so now, when we understand what's happening with COVID, and we're seeing the disparate responses and outcomes in terms of more Black and brown folks are dying, and how folks are being treated or talked about in terms, or the lack of discussion of how this is disproportionately affecting Black and brown communities, on top of being sequestered in our homes. And then we see the Amy Coopers, and then here we go with George Floyd. And again, this is not new. It's kind of like repeat. And I think folks, again, they were tired. I wanted to add that.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you did, because one of the things that also makes COVID relevant to this part of the conversation is looking at, you know, job losses, layoffs, furloughs, and those kinds of things, and the ways that capitalism demands return on investment from the organization, and therefore will oftentimes sacrifice the individual for the good of the organizational health. And so I think that's a sort of reflection that we should definitely dive a bit more into. The other thing that I really want to share is I was watching LA 92 the other day on Netflix. And it was chilling to hear the president of that local ACLU saying that when it came to the beating of Rodney King, it wasn't new because it was happening, it was new because it was caught on camera. And remembering all the times that Black men and women and children have been murdered on camera, and this dialogue being resurgent of, it's the first time we've seen it happen. And so it's at least been almost, you know, at this point, 30 years that we've seen it happening on camera, and yet still it continues. At this point, I want to make sure that we have all of our panelists, I apologize. But Dr. Alexander, I want to kind of pivot to you and think about the structural way of medicine and healthcare is being in a sort of form of racism. So how has medical science been used to both reinforce and perpetuate racism? And how does that sort of continue to happen? Can you talk a little bit about those?
Absolutely. But first, you know, I just really want to be quiet and continue to listen to this dialogue. It's fascinating. And I want to say thank you so much for inviting me, Spence, but also I want people who are observing this and they want to take notes. This is what happens. This is the type of panel that's put together when a scholar puts together a panel, and not when you've just identified the person that looks like the population that you're about to speak about. So anyway, you can interpret that, but I know Spence knows what I mean. And to my colleague, Dr. Charbonnette, I want to say this because I was on a panel last week and I was asked to give my personal feelings. And so I'm going to read from what I wrote then. And I'm going to get to the question because it's a brilliant question. But I said last week, I am conscious that most people I encounter daily experience me as someone different from those who are engaging in violent protests, but I am not different. That is me. I am just coping differently. And I think that is very important in terms of what's going on. And then to your point about, you know, the importance of historical nature, I try to, I watch a little bit more television than most people with a terminal degree, but it's the way that I relax. But I'm looking at these old TV dramas and the dramas about the police and about cops. You can go back to TV shows in the 1960s and the 1950s that reflect riots. And there's one particular show that talked about the riots in Watts and the efforts that were made at that time to bring the police and the Black community together. So this idea that this is new because it's televised and relevant, many people have forgotten about Rodney King. Many people have, that's not in their consciousness. And I think to tie COVID into this, I also said last week, I think that we've been still because of the pandemic. And that's how we were still, we were forced to pay attention to that we didn't pay attention to before. I'm glad that you asked this question. And again, I reflect on your scholarship in this question, Spence, because I think that very often we don't have the right questions. And so to think about this medical reasons, we refer to many Black Americans now as those who experience health disparities. And we experience people of color often, people of color that represent our non-mainstream society as people who have a fatalistic attitude about healthcare. So it's important that we understand the roots of this question, and I think this gets to the structural nature of this. For a lie to be effective, it has to be designed to put people at ease with not seeking the truth. And this country has a very shameful past as a leader in medical malpractice and constructing a reality in order to benefit from blatant distortions of the truth and a failure to acknowledge the medical system's role in perpetrating this fraud. And so when you talk about systems, I think it's really important. Some of the best examples, the best historical examples of this are highlighted in a book written by Harriet Washington in 2006, entitled The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Blacks from Colonial Times to the Present. And so not only does this reference include the more well-known Tuskegee syphilis study, but provides compelling and overwhelming evidence of experimentation on slaves. Indeed, some people, groups purchase slaves, or some individuals, white individuals purchase slaves for the sole purpose of experimentation. And so this book talks about that and gives a timeline that shows not only atrocities committed in the 1800s, but the legacy of a history and how that is played out today. So this idea that we have a mistrust of the medical system it's actually, when you think about it, very rational and well thought out. So in the early 1800s and 1900s, the medical field, there were examples of things that they didn't understand, like sickle cell anemia. So they used their lack of understanding to interpret what might be happening with cells and blood at the time. And somehow this was perceived as a further inferiority of Blacks as a species. There were lies perpetuated about violence and the propensity to rape. And those lies were twofold. They were promoted to instill a fear to control white women at the time, and those in the upper crust of society from experimenting or seeking or having what we would consider acceptable relationships with other people. But it was linked also to genetic studies on Black prisoners at the time. And then one of the enduring legacies is a myth that Blacks are impervious to pain because many of the early experiments were done without administering ether or any kind of pain medicine as a part of surgeries. And so this notion that somehow Blacks did not feel pain, and we can talk later, this is perpetuated today. And there are many, many, many contemporary examples of how this lie that's been perpetuated has reared its ugly head in medical practice. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of this was William Shockley. Don't want to give his name too much, but I would encourage you to read about it. And it's important to talk about the construction of structural racism and how it takes hold. So it's not one or two people thinking something, but in this case, medicine, as revered as medicine is in this country especially, William Shockley won a Nobel Prize in 1956 for his work in physics, and he worked on semiconductors. But he personally became obsessed with the notion of racial intelligence. And so he published in medical journals that Blacks were inferior, and also that they should be sterilized. None of this work was scientific, mind you. He was renowned for his work in semiconductors, so obviously his personal musings about genetic inferiority must be accepted. And so this publication in revered journals like the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, these lies were further perpetrated as science. And so people begun to believe in this genetic inferiority of a species. In the early 1960s, psychiatrists were writing about the Black psyche. And interestingly enough, they said that Blacks were somehow inferior because given our history and our lack of power and privilege, we should surely be committing suicide at higher rates. And so the fact that we were not mentally weak as a people was seen as a negative. And there were things that were written that the American Negro is so misguided, they don't realize that they should kill themselves. So in all of these things have played out in our more contemporary terms. And I think it's so important that we frame these questions in the context of medical lives, because when you talk about disparities, it's as though people come on this earth, they're born with this innate sense to be mistrustful of systems. But if you follow this, and William Shockley died in 1989, and so that's the other connection that I think people forget. These things were perpetuated. There's very little press or dialogue about how erroneous these things were. And when Harriet Washington wrote her book in 2006, and other faculty members were thinking about adding this to their course, sense of course readings, this was seen as it was a very revolutionary idea that someone would actually write about medical apartheid. And I think more of this is accepted now, but I think that that gets at the essence, and we can go back later. eager and anxious to hear from Dr. Mayo, but we can talk about how that construction of reality has, reared its ugly head in contemporary medicine, so that we're left with a lack of understanding, but an unwillingness. So I don't accept that it's just merely that we don't know. It's what I said in the beginning. There's some method to the madness of perpetuating these notions about genetic inferiority. So I'll stop there.
And I'm really struck by a couple of things that you mentioned. And the first is that you were talking about the experimentation on enslaved people because of the belief that they do not feel pain, or that they don't feel the same level of pain as white people. And that led me to recollecting the story of the person who's referred to as the father of modern gynecology, James Marion Sims, who his entire praxis was around research, quote unquote, but really torture of enslaved Black women in the pursuit of repairing, it was a fistula, and I forget what it was, that essentially prevented childbirth. And again, going back to the conversation that we were having with Dr. Charbonnette, the reason that this was important was because if an enslaved woman was unable to have children, she was unable to perpetuate the owner's wealth. And so this was a really important thing that a lot of slaveholders were fascinated by, and really felt they were in need of in order to continue growing their wealth and their workforce. And even this idea of today, we still pay prisoners to experiment on them is a manifestation of this sort of same thing. So I really appreciated you talking about both of those, because I think that they kind of go hand in hand. And of course, we can talk all about the prison industrial complex, and all of you, I'm sure, will have more than enough to contribute to that. But I definitely want to dive a little bit more into what it is that you were discussing, and looking a little bit at, are these sort of isolated? Do we only look at rural communities of color or urban communities of color in a particular way, or is this really truly sort of an overarching phenomenon that we're seeing? Can you share some thoughts on that, Dr. Alexander?
Well, I think it might be overarching, but I think there might be different histories that converge. When I was explaining to one of my colleagues why I need to dash off work this afternoon and get to the panel, this is someone who grew up in Appalachia. And I said, it's really interesting. I mean, I know why we're having the discussions we are today, and it's important, and we shouldn't leave race. One thing that we've learned, we should not leave racism and race out of conversations. But I think there are some similarities in that which we speak, and there is a method to the madness of perpetuating myths about rural Americans. There, and we forget that. I mean, we talk about some of those things in very polite ways and with academic speak, but the truth of the matter is, if you look at how businesses are and the money that's gone into the Appalachian region, and then the problems that persist, and you think about, well, who benefited from that? And so this idea that it's important to keep a lie going and a dialogue about people being fatalistic and not being interested in their own health, and not being interested in gaining their own wealth, and then a system that has been designed to continue to keep people quote unquote in their place. So I think, for the purpose of this panel, we're talking about its skin color. Dr. Charbonnette says, I don't speak for all Black people, and I agree with her, but I'm often quoted as saying, I've been Black all my life. And that's so people to understand, for 65 years, I've experienced this, either directly or indirectly, the things that we're talking about. But I think when you talk about rural populations, and I think that there are things that we can learn about linguistics, there are things that we can learn about myths. And I think that we can learn, and that might be what when the oppressed and the oppressor come together. That, I'm not saying anybody's going to put away their Confederate flag, but I think if people looked and understood mining, for instance, in West Virginia, and who benefited from mining and who died from the disease, and what happened to Black miners and Black Hawk's Nest and some of those things, that I think we'll see some of those similarities. So I think that structural isms are designed to keep certain people from benefiting equally from things in contemporary societies, and things that all families and all people desire. So we can talk about that more later.
Thank you. I'm fascinated by what you're talking about. And we actually have some questions from folks looking for the book that you mentioned. Would you mind putting that in the chat to the whole group so that everybody can have reference to that?
I absolutely will, Spenser.
Thank you, thank you. Dr. Mayo, I want to bring you into this conversation and really start thinking about the connections between racism and transphobia and homophobia and really the embedded nature of superordination and subordination in our society. And I just was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that and those connections that are important for us to make as we think about our role in society.
I think it's a great combination to be making. And I think Dr. Charbonnette and Dr. Alexander both have set this up as a conversation that makes sense in the context of longer term histories of exploitation and longer term histories of ignorance. And so if you go back to the US being settled as a settler colonial state, it was settled in places where there were more than two genders. And so when the LGBTQ community thinks of itself and its history, or it ought to be thinking of itself and its history, and this in some ways answers Melanie Page's question, should we be teaching courses or should we be infusing this? We should be doing both, because often our communities don't understand that the systems of gender that we think we're innovating are returning to systems of gender that have been systematically oppressed, right? And so I'm not saying appropriate, but I am saying to all of us, no matter our race, think about how we have grown up in systems that have constrained our imagination about who we could be for profit. And it might be for profit attached to particular religious doctrines. It might be for profit attached to particular understandings of what the perfectly medicalized body is. But we can't talk about contemporary trans politics without talking about settler colonialism. We can't talk about settler colonialism without talking about exploitative, oppressive forms of racism. And so in the midst of also talking about that, I want to say this is an educational project. And I really appreciate Dr. Alexander talking about this connection between the rage of people in streets against racism and the ways that we move through the academy as seeming different and not being different. Because I think that rage has permeated why we are interested in higher education in the first place. Why so many people entered an institution, now I'm going to skip a couple of hundred years, say WVU, we're part of Moral 2, where you could set up segregated institutions. WVU by its nature and its founding is segregated. We are working against a system that was meant to be racially segregated. When we talk about changing our institution, we have to reckon with our history. When we talk about reckoning with our history, we, and I'm going to go to the LGBTQ plus community, including people of color, people of diverse ethnicities, races, nations, classes, we also have to be thinking about the fact that we come from diverse backgrounds. We are a community that has civil rights because of the civil rights movement, because there were activists who were really willing to advocate for racial equality. We have now, just a few days ago, Title frickin' 7 of the 1964 Civil Rights Act applies to us. Now, I could go on a longer conversation, I won't, it's too much of a short cut or whatever, long way around. But I wanna say, this is, I think, the dilemma that we're living with. We are both indebted to civil rights, but we also know that Title 7 was basically a reinstallation of the 14th Amendment. So policies can help us, but if the first interpretation of the 14th Amendment is to say that corporations are people, to go, I think, to Dr. Charbonnette's point, if the first iteration is to protect corporations and not people who have just been freed from slavery, that means that the system is rigged. And so when you talk about systems, when you talk about systemic racism, you're talking about a system that will always be rigged. And until you deal with the root causes, that system is going to continue to perpetuate racial injustice. In LGBTQ communities, until we deal with the root causes of racism among those white members of our community, we're going to have racism as one of our major problems. And so we've all grown up in segregated communities. We've all grown up with redlining. whether you were redlined as a person of color out of a community, or you were covenant of restriction as a white person into a community. My particular family was both. We were not allowed to buy the property that we bought, but we passed. We're Jewish, not a person of color. We passed, even though there is a restriction on the deed that my family has for their home. But so we passed, which means that we sold out, right? There are many communities in which people go to those communities because they have good schools. And good schools means white majority schools. And that means well-funded schools. And that means as you grow up and begin to understand yourself, and now I am talking about LGBTQ people, you understand what racial segregation is, because you're growing up within those spaces and you're learning the tacit lessons of either you're living in an oppositional community that's going to be knocking its heads against racism all your life, but you're also going to be living in a community that has developed oppositional and creative strategies for survival, if you're a person of color. If you're a white person, you're going to be claiming, my parents moved us to this neighborhood because they wanted to shelter us, which literally means wanted to keep us away from people of color. And so interrupting those narratives has to be part of what we do in higher education. This is the duration of this is centuries. It doesn't mean that taking 1 or 2 classes is going to solve it, but it does mean that difficult conversations like Spenser, you and DEI have structured today are critically important. I would guess that many of the panelists do see each other from time to time, but moving through a predominantly white institution as a person of color is going to be alienating. We need more spaces that bring people of color together to enhance their sense of connectedness. We need more occasions to make sure that we who are white understand that people of color are the experts on this. Yes, others of us have read and we've taught classes, but there's an experiential base, a familial base, a legacy base to what we're talking about that makes this more than personal. There literally is the weight of centuries. And I think those of us who are in the LGBTQ community need to look at how that weight affects what we do. We need to look at the fact that there are differential rates of murder for trans women of color. We know that every year this rate is going up. We know that sometimes this has to do with the economic choices that people are forced to make because they are forced out of public schools, which is something I'm interested in. We know that this is related to homelessness. It's related to gender dysphoria, which is manufactured by a society, not in someone's psyche. It's manufactured by oppressive experiences. A system creates the conditions whereby someone is in a situation where their life is at risk. And so the more that we look at this as systematic, the more we understand that we need to start undoing these systems, whether it's the system of normatively embodied people, as Dr. Alexander was talking about, the idea that Black women don't feel pain is a normative idea that white women need to be protected. If you're a white woman, whether you're cis, gender nonconforming, LGBTQ, whatever, you need to be standing up and recognizing that history. That history should offend you, it should trouble you, it should motivate you to action to make it stop. Because it's not about us, it's about changing the system. And I think that's what we really need to be talking about more. We need to realize there are differences among all of the people that we're talking about when we talk about all the varieties of Black lives that matter. It matters if you're an immigrant trying to come to this country to claim asylum and you're not allowed in because your skin color is not white. It matters if you're a trans person and you can't live your fullest life because you're facing violence, whether it's from members of your own affective community, family, or whatever, or whether it's stranger murders. These are things that we have to challenge. And if you're someone who is simply looking as if you're spectatorial to this resurgence of civil rights in Black Lives Matter, I would say, no matter how difficult, you have to join in, especially if you're LGBTQ. We have a responsibility to the forms of more than binary gender that occurred among people who are indigenous. We have a responsibility to the same-sex affections that came from Africa, that people learned from here. We have a responsibility to the oppositional communities created in the Harlem Renaissance that started the gay rights movement, really. We have a responsibility to the trans women of color who helped lead the riots. Now, a lot of people were involved in the riots. This was a wonderful coalition at Stonewall. And I think it's time to come back to that coalition, but not to keep undone the work of challenging systemic structural racism and settler colonialism.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. I'm blown away, and I really, really appreciate the way that you layered on top of layer of how it starts at the settler colonialism level, and the ways in which these ideas just permeate throughout all of our systems. One of the things that you mentioned is that you said, I'm not white, I'm Jewish, right? Or you weren't white. And so I want to draw folks' attention. There's a book called How Jews Became White Folks and What That Tells Us About Race in America. That is such a fascinating read, thinking about how do we integrate in the us and how do we ensure that we're keeping out the them. And a lot of what you're hearing, whether we're talking about the LGBTQ plus community, whether we're talking about communities of color, indigenous communities, immigrant communities, is really motivated by a fear of the other, and trying to ensure that there's access to benefit for only a select few. And that inherently that is built upon a system of injustice and dispossession. So, I mean, it's you. Wow, thank you so much for that. And so one of the questions that we were going to address and that somebody actually brought up is, so what does that look like here at a university, right? Where is this showing up and what do we do about this? This idea of structural racism and interlocking structures of oppression. What are ways that folks can start to get engaged? I'm going to bring in another question. Somebody who said, I found it hard to talk about diversity on a predominantly white campus. So what kind of spaces are being created? What are some ways that we can intentionally start to work against these structural forms of oppression and all the other forms of othering that we're encountering?
I would say I would direct everybody to the Black Student Demands. These are really smart readings of all of the structures on campus, everything from admissions to student support, to spaces for not just recruiting, but retention, to hiring faculty, to thinking about courses. These are students who have gone through this university and done what I was writing to one of them a few days ago, saying that every diversity committee I've ever been on has made these suggestions after years and years of meeting in subcommittees. They're brilliant suggestions, right? If we want to change the character of a moral two university, we need to go to the moral high ground, just to kind of pun there for a second, and think about how to restructure how we support people. And that also means thinking about support for faculty of color. That means creating conditions whereby people want to stay here, cluster hires, mentorship programs, things that are compensated though, not things that are add-ons. We all know the additional burden of faculty of color in terms of doing informal mentorship with students, helping to keep faculty of color together on campus, and changing the character of how we teach and learn, whether it's pedagogically, curricularly, or degree redesign. This needs to become something that is recognized as a job. Now, it may very well be a vocation. That's great. I am so pleased with how passionate everyone is. Pay. Think of it as part of reparations, right? If there was a mistake in your design at the beginning, you can fix it. But we're all really smart people, but compensate people for their labor. And that means paying students. If the students are going to be leading groups, make sure they're paid. Make sure everyone knows this is key, important consulting work. We hire consultants to do a lot of things. It's time that we look at the value in our universities and we recognize the value that we have, and we encourage more value to come in.
Thank you. Yeah, and would any of our other panelists like to also add their thoughts to what Dr. Mayo has sort of suggested at this point?
Constinia, I'm anxious to hear what you have to say. So I'm a mute because I'm anxious to hear what you would offer to this dialogue. Okay, you have to unmute.
I had a flippant little response. Well, thank you. Let me repeat it. Thank you, Dr. Alexander, for putting me on the carpet. I appreciate that. So I want to kind of go back to, I think your question was, and let me make sure I have it, is you want to know the systems of racism, how they show up in universities and how we do business?
Yeah, and sort of what we can do about it, right? How we can start to sort of claim hold of a way to start moving towards anti-racist work at our institution.
Wonderful. And one, let me first start by saying thank you, Dr. Mayo, for bringing up the letter from students, the students, staff, faculty, and allies to the university, which was very interesting to me. I think that it's important that, one, beyond having these critical conversations and these difficult dialogues, we've been talking for a very long time, right? A long time, where it's exhausting. Where's the action? So, you know, something that a woman, a scholar who was also in my doctoral program here at WV, her name is Dr. Kafila Malik, and she would often say, we have to move beyond food, folklore, fashion, and festivities. I have to quote her for that because it sticks with me. And she's so true when we approach this very important work. And I want to add on to that, where we talk about programming and we talk about these conversations and safe spaces. It must go beyond that. It must go to the fact that if we talk about our true commitment to this very important work, if we're talking about really making long-term change, then we have to invest in it like everything else. What I think is so interesting is when we think about how incredibly difficult the shift for universities across the country, business across around the country and the world, to continue to sustain, or as much as they could, in light of COVID. Everything shut down. We had to go completely online. So we had that was our charge. How do we maintain some sense of normalcy? How do we continue? How do we not let this impede, you know, our progress as an organization, as an institution? Particularly, I'm framing this in terms of universities. It was absolutely amazing. I saw it firsthand. I talked to colleagues across the country where folks who never taught online, they had to quickly, you know, address this because it was a charge, because it was not an option, right? What happens if we take that same approach when it comes to something as important, right, as the inequities, the social construction of race, and also the systematic racism within institutions? Heck, institutions of higher education, they are and always should be a conversation, but it's also all about action. So how are we investing? We invested in different things like Quality Matters at WVU. We brought in additional consultants, as Dr. Mayo talked about, but we also made sure that everyone did their part. They did their part. No one office, no one program, everyone had to pitch in, or they should have, I think so. What happens if we take that same approach when it comes to structural racism and when it comes to race and equity at institutions? The other piece I want to add before I close is the placement of different diversity courses and how we do this work and who's charged with doing it. Again, we all have to do our fair share, our part, and we have to educate ourselves. The one thing I want to point to is from Dr. Milan from the University of Virginia, as well. Oh gosh, her name is slipping me. I'm having a senior moment here. Where they start to reference who does this work. So I'm getting a number of questions from colleagues around the country and friends who are not like me, that they are not African American, and it's all about teach me, teach me, teach me. That is not our job, right? And I say that with love, right? Do our part, educate yourselves, and also how do we as an institution follow up? If we're talking about that we don't have, you know, when we talk about pure numbers, right, or the structure to support Black and Brown or underrepresented communities on campus, what are the practices in place that reinforce and perpetuate racism on campus? How many Amy Coopers do we have here on our campus? How many folks are, when we talk about this proverbial knee on my neck professionally, what happens? Are we monitoring and measuring the retention and success of folks here at the institution? And again, I'm going to go back to the placement of diversity courses. It cannot be an afterthought. If we want something, if we want students, faculty, and staff to really connect with the material and we want them to place an emphasis on it, then we have to put it up front and center. Some institutions do it. I can't wait for WVU and other institutions to look at that as an opportunity so that we can really make some change down the line.
Yeah, and I really appreciate, one of the things that I think you highlighted, right, is a couple of things. One is a sense of urgency. And a second is accountability and resources, right? How do we make sure that this is what we're teaching, what we're instilling, and what we're holding folks accountable for? And I think without either of it or any of those things, we're going to have a challenge in terms of being able to fundamentally transform who we are as an institution. And I know I want to recognize, I apologize that we're running short on time. We're going to wrap it up here in just 1 second, but Dr. Alexander, I know that you had a final thought that you wanted to share with us.
Yeah, just following up on what Dr. Charbonnette said, more people in this institution, in this university, should be students in a course or some type of structure that Dr. Nolan teaches, so that we can understand that very poignant role in the things that we've talked about. I think Dr. Mayo brought a wonderful example of who can stand with us in this movement and who's benefited from certain structures in the civil rights movement. And so we don't divide and conquer and say, well, what about my rights? What about my rights? That we're in this together. And so if you benefited from rights, and then if as an institution, we could flip the script so that we don't have to have GRE scores, so that we can change the tenure and promotion clock, so that we can add additional bandwidth, IT support, and everything. Think of this, racism is a virus. It's in many ways worse than COVID-19. And it has caused, now it is infiltrated so that our systems perpetuate students like the ones that we've seen who've recently been accepted to colleges and universities, who are texting inappropriate racial jokes on their phone and laughing out their way into a college because nobody will care that they really think this way. So they're bringing that disease with them and poisoning things. So that we are brilliant, we are the best, we go first. So why not take that structure? And I'll be able to present something to you, Spence. The person that was on the panel with me, who's the vice president of Inclusive Excellence at UNC Chapel Hill, wrote a piece that mirrors what Dr. Charbonnette was talking about, called What If? And it was about what if we looked at systems? And so there are many things that we can do. They need to be linked to our accreditation standards. They need to be linked to keeping our doors open and checking boxes, that the Board of Governors would be looking for these things in order to continue our excellent stamp as a Research One institution. And we can no longer depend on goodwill. And we are victims, and we are tired of being teachers. Victims can't continue to be the teachers.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that is exactly where we need to end this, is a sense of urgency amongst all of our community to take ownership and to think about this virus of structural racism as something that is now even more pressing to eradicate. At this point, I want to apologize. I know that we had many more questions that we weren't able to address. We are going to work to pull together those questions and to follow up to answer them. But I also want to inform you that next week at the same time, we have a panel called Rethinking Pride, Adapting a Movement, to think about a lot of those things that Dr. Mayo brought to our attention, so we can think about how do the murders of Nina Pop and Tony McDade that don't make the same type of headline, how are they just as important to these conversations on race, racism, and being a queer person or a trans person in this country. I want to thank my esteemed panelists, Dr. Alexander, Dr. Charbonnette, Dr. Mayo, and Dr. Nolan. I could not have done this without you, and I greatly appreciate the expertise that each of you brought to this discussion. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week to discuss how we can rethink pride. Thank you.